Okay, we're all set. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Jane DeMarines, and I'm the Executive Director of Sustainable Earth Eating. And my guest today is far more well-known than me, Dr. Neal Barnard, the President and Founder of Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, a network that includes 12,000 physicians, 150,000 nutritionists, educators, and supporters. It also has a medical center. Dr. Barnard has written 20 books, and his diabetes research has revolutionized nutritional approaches to type 2 diabetes in our country. Welcome, Dr. Barnard, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you.
So let's get started. Would you agree that the greatest threat to consumer health, as well as to planet Earth, are the dangers posed by meat consumption?
Yes, I would. And this has been something that for us, really as a world community, have been a bit slow to understand. And that was certainly true for me in my own life. I grew up in North Dakota, and my grandfather was a cattle rancher, and my dad grew up in that business, and so did my cousins and my uncles and everybody. And these were honest, good people in a good business. But as time went on, they found themselves in kind of the same situation as the tobacco farmers before them, which is they got involved in something. The problems of it became more and more apparent and became undeniable. And with regard to the meat industry, it's a long list, from cardiovascular disease and cancer and diabetes and obesity to climate problems, to animal welfare problems, to a huge list of things that now society is confronting and has to confront.
Thank you. You had the foresight to promote plant-based nutrition as a hugely important medicine. Hippocrates and Albert Einstein had similar views, your predecessors. Can you talk a little bit more about when? I recognize that you have parents and grandparents that were in the business of producing meat, but when did you become a vegetarian? What's your own origin story?
Well, I have to say, the year before I went to medical school, I was working in a hospital in Minneapolis, and I was the autopsy assistant, and which means that every time a person died in the hospital, I got a medical lecture in graphic detail about what could kill you. And so one day we had a person who died in the hospital of a massive heart attack, probably from eating hospital food, but that's another story. So anyway, the pathologist knew that I was headed for medical school, and he wanted to make sure that every examination was a chance for me to learn. So he exposed the heart of this patient who had died. And this is not done with great delicacy. You take what's like a garden clipper and just go crunch through the ribs. And he pulled the ribs off the chest and set them on the table. And he said, "Look in there." And he sliced open a coronary artery. And he said, we call them coronary arteries because they crown the heart. And he said, "Stick your finger in there." And I had gloves on, and I felt inside, and it was like concrete. And he said, "That's atherosclerosis. That's your bacon. That's your eggs. It does that." And anyway, this was quite an eye-opener for me. At the end of the exam, he left, and I had to clean up. I put the ribs back in the chest, sewed up the skin, cleaned everything up. And it was a long day, so I went up to the cafeteria, and they were serving ribs for lunch. And I have to tell you that the smell of it and the look of it was just like the body that I had been working on. And I realized this is a dead body that they're offering for you to eat. And I didn't become a vegetarian on the spot, but I couldn't eat that. And it started to work on me. And as time went on, the connections between food and health became clearer and clearer.
Wow, that's quite a story. Do you see any changes with federal legislation related to federally funded school lunch program to open it up to vegan options and non-dairy milk? There are a lot of students that are lactose intolerant, as you know. I know that you were working at this, or your organization was working at the state level, and California has a bill that's passed one part of their legislature. And then New York City, under Eric Adams, apparently has a citywide school lunch program that allows vegan options. But I was wondering if you saw anything in on the federal scene.
Yes, the progress is not what we need it to be, but there has been progress. It's always slower than it should be. When I say it's slow, I mean the science has marched ahead very rapidly. We already have scientifically the tools to prevent the vast majority of heart attacks. We can prevent a lot of cancer cases. We can tackle diabetes and obesity. We know how to do these things, but you've asked the critical question, which is, when does this become policy? The dietary guidelines for Americans are reformulated every 5 years, and they have gotten better and better and better, and they are very favorable to plant-based diets. They don't say, you won't get protein if you don't eat meat. They don't say any of those kind of old-fashioned myths. So they're getting better. But if you're a kid in school, the law still says that, let's say you're lactose intolerant, you're 16 years old, you can't drink milk, which is the case for a lot of kids, particularly kids of color. By law, to this day, as we're recording this now, the person at the lunch line can't say, oh, you can't digest cow's milk, here's some almond milk for you. Here's some soy milk. They could say, I can drink that at home. By law, they can't give that to you unless you bring a note saying you've got a disability or you have a medical condition. Now, some would say that's a racist law because particularly for African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, lactose intolerance becomes the rule as you reach adulthood. But those laws are still in the books and they've got to change.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm Eastern European, and a lot of Eastern Europeans also are lactose intolerant. Not as many, I think, as the other groups you named.
But this is the biological norm, and not just for the human species, but for all mammalian species. The whole idea is that Mother Nature's idea, if I can put it this way, was milk supports the growth of the baby. When the baby's big enough to eat on his own, on her own, there's no milk anymore. You don't need that. So that's true for all mammals, except human beings. Being so creative, we decided I don't ever have to be weaned. I can drink milk from mom all my life. But it's not you, it's a cow that you take their milk from, and we make it into cheese and yogurt and things. But these are all things that Mother Nature still can't believe we've decided that we feel we need. And we lose the enzymes to digest the milk sugar around the age of weaning or in the years that follow that. And for many Europeans and people of European descent, a genetic mutation keeps those enzymes around a longer period of time, but that's the exception. For most humans, lactose intolerance is normal. It is the rule, and it's not a disease. It's totally normal.
Thank you for that explanation. What I know that PCRM is dedicated to educating consumers, doctors, and other health professionals on the benefits of plant-based diet. Do you have any goals related to climate health, since there certainly is a connection in the country between animal agriculture and the amount of agricultural land, 80%, that's dedicated to animal agriculture, and only meat only represents 20% of the calories needed globally. So it's not even efficient really as a food globally.
The environmental pressures have become only more urgent. Frances Moore Lappé, a generation ago, wrote a book called Diet for a Small Planet. She made the case that if we want to feed a hungry world, you're not going to get there by taking all the feed grains and feeding them to hogs and getting a pork chop out of it, or feeding them to cattle and getting some milk or some meat. No, the efficient thing to do is to eliminate the middleman and let people eat grains. Let them eat beans. Let them eat these foods directly. And she calculated quite correctly that the amount of food you can produce if we are consuming the plants directly is dramatically more than if we feed these foods to animals and get a little bit of meat out of them as a result. Many people have heard that message, agree with it, and follow it. Many others don't. And we've had, ever since you wrote that book, this clash of business interests and sort of environmental interests. But it's become all the more acute with greenhouse gas emissions, as they become very clear that cows are belching animals. They belch out methane, which is a particularly potent greenhouse chemical, and that wouldn't matter if we had 1 or 2 cows. But if you had close to 100 million of them on dairy farms and meat farms in the United States and elsewhere, it becomes quite a potent environmental effect. And the beauty of it is it's power that you can exercise right now. You don't have to wait to cap a smokestack you can decide what you're having for breakfast every day. And that gives people the power to change the climate or save it to the, if it's not too late. We have some power now that we can take individually.
That's a huge point, that consumers can do things immediately that aren't really huge. You don't have to buy a Tesla. You can do things that are a little less expensive.
And we don't have to wait for our government or other governments to take action. This is something you can do in your school, in your family, in your business, in your community. And as Eric Adams said, okay, lunchtime Friday, vegan. And it's an environmentally responsible thing to do. And the better thing would have to do it Monday through Friday. But that's a step, and people can make those choices every single day.
That's vegan 5.0, right? Instead of just vegan 1.0.
You got it.
Dr. Barnard, as you know, the percent of overweight Americans continues to rise. And however, overweight children and teens, it seems even more worrisome. It's our future. About 22% in the United States today are overweight, with 4 times the risk of developing diabetes, as you certainly know. How do you reach that age group? And are federal programs, federal government programs necessary because it is such a threat?
It's perhaps the most important question of our time, is to how to help those people whose tastes are really taking shape and whose health risks are following that. When you see diabetes in a 45-year-old man, the seeds for that were sown with the dietary preferences that they learned at age 4 and age 5. Started to manifest as overweight at age 14 and 15, and insulin resistance around that same time. And they didn't know they had insulin resistance any more than they knew they had atherosclerosis. But if you can look inside their muscle and liver cells, which we actually can do with magnetic resonance spectroscopy, we can see that the damage is starting before they get their high school diplomas.
Wow.
And if you were to do angiography, not that you would do this, but we have the technical ability to do it. If you would do this in a teenager, could be the most fit teenager, the quarterback of the football team. You see the hardening of the arteries, that the atherosclerotic blockages forming in the abdominal aorta, starting in the coronaries, hitting the carotids. They're not going to have a stroke for a few decades. They're not going to have a myocardial infarction until later, but the disease process has started. So what do? We have to serve healthful foods in the cafeteria. Parents have to understand that it's not the old 1950s idea of a meat serving and then a starch and da-da-da-da-da. The meat should be off the plate and the chicken and fish with it. And we should learn those simple, healthy staples that really advance health much better. Beans and grains and vegetables and fruits that our grandparents didn't know about, but that the current generation doesn't see much of.
Well, that concludes my questions. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Dr. Barnard?
Only that we're all in this together. Whether you live in North America, you live in Europe, you live in Africa, you live in Asia, wherever we are, we're all subject to the same kinds of health risks, to the same environmental damage, and we all have the same power to turn that around. And to the extent that we embrace these simple, healthy, compassionate, and environmental friendly foods, we've got power to help ourselves, to help each other, most importantly, to help the next generation.
Thank you so much for that message. And thank you so much for the work that you do and continue to do, but in creating such a powerful organization to do so much good for our country. This has been Jane DeMarines with Sustainable Earth Eating, again with Dr. Neal Barnard, the founder and president of Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. Thank you, Dr. Barnard.
Thank you.